Hello everyone, my name is Beng Xiang Young and I'm going to present to you the paper Bayesian Autoencoders for Drift Detection in Industrial Environments, which was written by me and my colleagues Yasmin Fatty and Alexandra Brintrup. In recent years, we have seen machine learning algorithms to be used to extract insights from sensor data, and they can be high-dimensional data, as we have heterogeneous sensors such as temperature, vibration, pressure, or current sensors, and they can actually exhibit complex and nonlinear interactions and also exposed to dynamic environment. That is, the data is rarely stationary. An emerging area of research is the uncertainty quantification of deep learning models, and primarily there are two types of uncertainties. Firstly is the epistemic uncertainty, which are due to the model parameters in a limited training data availability context, and they can actually be reduced if we have more data. And secondly is the aleatoric uncertainty, which arises from the noise in the data, and we usually refer them as irreducible. Now there are two types of drift which I introduced to you. Firstly is the real drift, and they refer to the real changes in the objects and environment of interest as they are being affected over time. And applications of the real drift detection is actually on condition monitoring or quality prediction of a manufacturing line. And in contrast, for virtual drift, the real objects of interest are not being affected, whereas it's the sensors and the measurement systems which are affected over time. And these can actually lead to increasing noise or drift level in the sensors data. And we find applications of detecting them to be within the context of sensor faults detection. Now, however, uncertainty quantification of unsupervised deep models are relatively understudied in industrial sensors context, especially within these two types of drift. And that leads us to motivate three contributions within this paper. Firstly is the development of Bayesian autoencoders for detection of drift in industrial sensors. And they are actually an unsupervised uncertainty quantification of epistemic and aleatoric uncertainty method. And also thirdly, the unsupervised classification of drifts, which will be based on the trio reconstruction loss, epistemic, and aleatoric uncertainty. Next, I will talk about the formulation of the Bayesian autoencoder. Every autoencoder consists of two parts: an encoder F, which maps the input to a latent space H, and decoder G, which maps the latent code back to its output or reconstructed signal. And assume that we have an unlabeled training data, capital X, and we denote the output of the autoencoder as X hat. Now, based on Bayes' rule, we are interested in finding the posterior of the parameters of the autoencoder theta given the training data X. And it is the product of the likelihood and the prior divided by the evidence. For the likelihood term, we would assume a Gaussian likelihood on the data, where the mean is actually the output of the autoencoder. And for the prior, for simplicity, we will use Gaussian prior on the weights and biases of the autoencoder. Whereas for evidence, usually it is assumed to be constant and ignored in approximate sampling. Due to the intractability of the equation of the Bayes rule for the autoencoder, various approximation options exist for us to sample from the posterior. Number one, we can use Markov chain Monte Carlo or MCMC, variation inference, random map sampling, or MC dropout. And in our work, we will use Bayesian ensembling with anchored priors. This is how we train the model. We have the raw sensors data, and we pass it through the autoencoder, which comprises of the encoder and a dense layer, which is the bottleneck, and the dense decoder, where then we have a dual output of mu and sigma, which is slightly different from the usual autoencoders. And gf of xi is actually the reconstructed signal, whereas the sigma here is actually the predicted variance of the Gaussian likelihood. And it is also referred as the heteroscedastic aleatoric uncertainty. Then we are seeking to minimize the map loss, which is the sum of the negative log likelihood loss and the regular prior loss. Now, for the log likelihood loss, we can see that this term actually arises from the Gaussian likelihood assumption that then this is in the term in the middle is actually the reconstruction loss of the data and also the output of the autoencoder, whereas this sigma here is actually the aleatoric uncertainty. Then for the prior loss, which acts as a regularizer on the weights, we assume we assume them to be Gaussians, and we subtract a theta anchor, which is a method for having better approximate samples from the Bayesian posterior, where theta anchor is actually a prior sample from n mu anchor and sigma anchor. Then the total loss is just the sum of both of these two terms. During prediction, we train multiple of those autoencoders as mentioned before, and AE1, AE2, AEN, for example, then we'll get all of these predictions of the ensemble and append them and get the mean of the predictions, which is the reconstructed signal, and then to get the variance of the mu, that will lead us to the epistemic uncertainty of the reconstructed signal, and then the mean of the sigma will give us the aleatoric uncertainty of the signal. Now we'll talk about the experiments that we use to evaluate our model. The dataset that we use is a publicly available dataset, which is on the condition monitoring of a hydraulic system recorded at Zima, Germany, and we have 70 sensors mounted on the system, such as pressure, temperature, vibration, so on and so forth. And we are interested in finding the faults or detecting the faults of these components, such as the cooler, valve, pump, and accumulator. And in this data, we have 2,205 working cycles, which in machine learning terms are referred to as data examples. Each of these cycles lasts for 60 seconds, and we resample them to 1 Hz for all the sensors, and that leads us to 1,020 data points for every cycle. Whereas for our Bayesian autoencoder architecture, we are using the following network architecture, where this part, these 3 numbers here is the number of nodes in the encoder, and this number 3 is actually the latent layer or the bottleneck layer, and the rest are the reflection of the encoder, which is the decoder architecture. And we train 10 of these individual autoencoders to form the ensemble. Now for our training data, we use the healthy cooler data, which comprises of 70% of all the healthy cooler data. And during tests, we test on the non-drift and also the drift data. For non-drift, we are using the subset of the healthy cooler data, which is the remaining of the data, which is 30%. Whereas for the drift set, we have a degrading cooler data, that is the cooler is actually degrading on the hydraulic system, where the health can be 20% and 3%. And we also simulate virtual drift, such as the injected noise from levels for 5 to 25%, and injected drift from 5 to 25% into one of the sensors. And in our experiments, our results at least, we show on the pressure sensors injected the drift. And we also release our full code publicly available at this link below at GitHub, and so it is fully reproducible and transparent. Next, I'll talk about the results and discussion. Now, when we look into the reconstructed signals of the autoencoder, we can actually get interpretable insights and better understanding of how the outputs are actually behaving at a lower level. So On panel A, we have the reconstructed signal of a normal data, where we can notice that there's not much of a difference between the reconstructed and the measured signal, and subsequently the loss is very low, and also the aleatoric and epistemic uncertainty are also very low. Whereas for the injected noise, we can see that there's an increase in loss because there's a much more of a difference between the reconstructed and also the measured signal. The aleatoric uncertainty actually doesn't decrease, that doesn't increase, whereas the epistemic uncertainty kind of increases a little. And for the cooler condition, which is degrading, then we can see that there's quite a huge increase in aleatoric and epistemic uncertainty. And even in this case, the reconstructed and the measured signal actually only changes a little in terms of their values. And for the case of injected drift, we can see the loss to increase a lot, and that's of course because there's quite a huge difference between the measured and the reconstructed signal, and the epistemic uncertainty also increases considerably. In conclusion, the reconstruction loss is unable to distinguish between a real and a virtual drift in the environment, and by observing the trio, reconstruction loss, epistemic and aleatoric uncertainties, we can notice there's quite a difference in the quality of the prediction of the Bayesian autoencoder, which we can actually leverage it for distinguishing these different real and virtual drifts, which we leave for future work. And uncertainty quantification using Bayesian autoencoders is largely unexplored in the industrial context, and this appears to be quite a promising field of research, which we can actually have a lot of deeper understanding of these deep models. And in future work, what we propose to do is to study more on leveraging the trio for the unsupervised classification of different drifts, and we can also determine more benchmarks and quantitative measures so that we can compare against existing methods. And we will also investigate variants of Bayesian autoencoder architectures as well as apply it on various datasets. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.